What if I told you that there is a critical piece of scripture that has been missing for thousands of years? A constitutional document so powerful it transforms scattered tribes into a mighty kingdom. A text that Jesus himself might have referenced but modern religious leaders rarely mention. Welcome aboard Arnie's Brain Train, where today we're excavating the mysterious Book of Statutes, the lost manual that guided Israel's kings, and contains wisdom deliberately kept from you. I'm Alex Arnold, your conductor on this journey through hidden biblical history. All sources used in this video are documented in the description below, so you can verify everything for yourself. Here we go. We're going to start our story in ancient Israel, approximately 1050 BCE. The tribal confederation is in a crisis. The people are demanding a king like all the other nations. Samuel, the last of Israel's judges and a powerful prophet, is deeply troubled by this request. He understands something the people don't, that kings can become tyrants who serve themselves rather than God or the people. So here's what Samuel does. Instead of simply anointing a king with unlimited power, he does something revolutionary that most religious leaders today won't emphasize. He creates what might be the world's first constitutional monarchy, with written limitations on governmental authority. Let's examine what the surviving biblical text actually tells us. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 25, we read, "Then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord." This isn't just a casual mention. This is evidence of a foundational constitutional document, often called the Book of Statutes, or the Book of the Kingdom. It outlined how Israel's monarchy should function, the rights, responsibilities, and limitations of royal power. But here's the mystery that should make you question what you've been taught. If this document was laid up before the Lord, why don't we have this document today? Unlike the Torah with its detailed laws, this constitutional scroll is mentioned once and then disappears from history, yet its impact was enormous. You have to ask yourself, why is this crucial text missing? Was it deliberately removed because it limited the power of religious and political authorities? Is this why most modern religious institutions rarely discuss it? Just think about what this means. Long before the Magna Carta, nearly 3,000 years before modern constitutions, Samuel created a document limiting governmental power. This text would have been known to Jesus and early Christians, yet how many sermons have you heard about it? The absence of this document from modern religious teaching reveals much about how institutions prioritize power over authentic spiritual knowledge. So what exactly did Samuel write in this mysterious document that religious authorities seem reluctant to emphasize? While we don't have the actual text, which should immediately raise questions about why it wasn't preserved like other scriptures, biblical scholars and historians have pieced together clues. First, we can examine Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, sometimes called the Law of the King. This passage, written before Israel had kings, outlines clear restrictions on royal power. The king must not acquire many horses, limiting military power. He must not take many wives, preventing foreign political alliances. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold, economic restrictions. He must write his own copy of God's law and read it daily, accountability to higher law. And he must not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, humility requirement. Many scholars believe Samuel likely incorporated these principles into his Book of Statutes, essentially creating a constitutional check on royal power. This is crucial because it establishes that governmental leadership was meant to be limited by divine law, something many religious institutions today conveniently overlook when seeking political influence. We can also infer content by examining how Samuel interacted with Saul and later how prophets like Nathan confronted David. These prophets clearly held kings accountable to standards beyond just do whatever you want because you're king. This suggests the Book of Statutes established a covenant relationship where the king was under God's law, not above it. Understanding this changes how we view ancient Israel. This wasn't just a typical ancient kingdom with an all-powerful monarch like Egypt or Babylon. It was closer to what we'd call a constitutional monarchy, where the king's powers were defined and limited by written law, a concept Jesus would have been intimately familiar with and likely referenced in his teachings about righteous leadership. What's remarkable is how this concept has been minimized in religious teaching. The early Christian church understood these principles before the great apostasy corrupted their doctrines. When priesthood authority was lost through the broken Catholic succession and later Protestant fragmentation, these crucial understandings about divinely limited government were distorted or abandoned. The restoration of true gospel principles requires reclaiming this understanding that all authority, whether religious or political, must be bound by divine law rather than exercising arbitrary power over others. To fully grasp why Samuel's Book of Statutes was so revolutionary and why its principles needed restoration after centuries of apostasy, we need to look at what kingship meant in other ancient Near Eastern societies. In Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. He was considered a god incarnate, absolute, unquestionable authority. In Mesopotamia, kings like Hammurabi claimed divine authorization to create laws but weren't themselves subject to those laws. Throughout the ancient world, the standard model was absolute monarchy, where the king's word was literally law. Then along comes Samuel with a radical idea that would later influence Jesus and the early Christians. Even the king is subject to written law. The king serves the people, not the other way around. The king answers to God and must follow established statutes rather than creating them at will. This is what makes the Book of Statutes so fascinating and explains why power-hungry religious institutions throughout history might prefer it remain lost. It completely flips the ancient understanding of royal power. Instead of power flowing from the king down, ultimate authority rested in the law itself, which came from God. The early Christians understood this concept well before the apostasy set in. Jesus himself emphasized that he came not to overthrow the law, but to fulfill it, showing that even the Messiah respected the boundaries of divine law, rather than claiming arbitrary authority. As Christianity fragmented and the priesthood authority was broken through papal corruptions and power struggles, this fundamental principle became distorted. Religious leaders began claiming the same type of unaccountable authority that Samuel had specifically written against in his Book of Statutes. Only through a restoration of true gospel principles can we reclaim this understanding that was known to Jesus and the early apostles, that authority is legitimate only when it submits to divine law, rather than placing itself above scrutiny. Now, this isn't just an abstract theology. It's about recognizing that many modern religious institutions have strayed from their foundational principles in the same way ancient Israel's kings often violated Samuel's constitutional limitations. It's a pattern, and we see it over and over again in the Bible. The real test of any constitution comes in its application. So how did this Book of Statutes actually affect Israel's kings? Let's examine 3 critical examples that demonstrate how Israel gradually departed from Samuel's original constitutional vision, a pattern that would later repeat with Christianity's apostasy. First, Saul, Israel's first king. Despite being chosen by God through Samuel, Saul repeatedly overstepped the boundaries established in the Book of Statutes. When Saul offered sacrifices himself instead of waiting for Samuel, only something priests were authorized to do, Samuel confronted him directly. This wasn't just a religious dispute, it was Israel's first constitutional crisis. Saul had violated the separation of powers outlined in the Book of Statutes. The consequence? Samuel pronounced that the kingdom would be taken from Saul's family line. This established a critical precedent. Even kings chosen by God were accountable to constitutional limitations. Next, we have David. Though described as a man after God's own heart, even David wasn't above the law. When he committed adultery with Bathsheba and arranged her husband's death, the prophet Nathan confronted him, essentially serving as a judicial check on royal power. David, unlike Saul, acknowledged his violation of the law and repented. Finally, consider Solomon. Initially a wise ruler who expanded Israel's influence, Solomon eventually ignored many of the limitations in Deuteronomy's Law of the King that were likely incorporated into Samuel's Book of Statutes. He acquired hundreds of wives, amassed tremendous wealth, and built a massive military. The result? After his death, the kingdom split into two, a consequence many scholars connect to his constitutional overreach. Now, this pattern of gradual departure from founding principles perfectly parallels what happened to Christianity. Jesus established a church with clear authority structures and doctrines. The early apostles maintained these boundaries. But over time, just as Israel's kings incrementally violated Samuel's constitution, church leaders introduced unauthorized changes, claimed powers beyond their authority, and ultimately broke the line of priesthood succession. Only through a restoration of original principles and authority can either system be brought back to its intended purpose. Just as Israel needed prophets to recall kings to their constitutional obligations, Christianity requires a restoration of gospel truths and priesthood authority to reclaim what was lost through centuries of apostasy. Here's something most religious educators won't tell you. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956, contain tantalizing clues that might relate to Samuel's lost Book of Statutes. The Qumran community that produced these scrolls was deeply concerned with proper governance and the corruption they saw in Jerusalem's religious leadership. Among the texts they preserved were several previously unknown works, including the Temple Scroll and the Community Rule, that outlined constitutional principles for righteous leadership. Many scholars believe these documents preserve elements of earlier constitutional traditions in Israel, potentially including concepts from Samuel's original Book of Statutes. The scrolls emphasize that leaders must be subject to divine law, that authority must be exercised within strict boundaries, and that no one, not even the high priest, was above accountability. Why is this significant? Because it suggests that even as mainstream Judaism was moving toward apostasy by Jesus' time, eventually failing to recognize him as the Messiah, there were faithful communities preserving older, purer traditions that aligned with the original constitutional vision Samuel had established. Jesus himself was likely familiar with these preserved traditions, explaining why his teachings often challenged the religious authorities of his day, who had departed from these fundamental principles of limited, accountable leadership. This pattern of faithful remnants preserving true principles during times of general apostasy is one we see repeatedly throughout religious history. It's a powerful reminder that truth is often maintained outside mainstream institutions when those institutions become corrupted by power and wealth. The Book of Statutes may be lost to history, but its legacy lives on, though not always in the religious institutions you might expect. When European political philosophers like John Locke and Montesquieu were developing theories of constitutional government and separation of powers, they drew inspiration from biblical concepts, including Samuel's approach to governance. These ideas then eventually influenced the American founding fathers, who created a constitution with checks and balances, partly inspired by biblical principles. The concept that no leader should be above the law traces a direct line back to Samuel's revolutionary document. But there is a profound irony here. While secular governments were incorporating these biblical principles of limited authority, many religious institutions were moving in the opposite direction, claiming increasingly centralized and unquestionable authority. This divergence wasn't accidental. The apostasy that affected both Judaism and Christianity led many religious institutions to abandon the very principles of accountable leadership that their foundational texts had established. The Jews who rejected Jesus were continuing a pattern of departure from original principles that had begun centuries earlier. Similarly, as Christianity fragmented after the Catholic line of succession was broken multiple times, many denominations established new power structures that prioritized institutional authority over the constitutional principles that Samuel had established and Jesus had honored. The restoration of true gospel principles requires returning to this original understanding that all authority must be subject to divine law, that power must be exercised within constitutional boundaries, and that leaders serve the people rather than dominating them. So what can we learn from this ancient constitutional experiment and its relevance to religious history? First, power needs boundaries, a principle that applies equally to political and religious authority. Second, written constitutions matter. By recording the rights and duties of kingship, Samuel created a standard that kings could be held accountable to, just as authentic religious authority must be measured against original scriptural standards. Third, the best governmental and religious systems recognize a higher authority than themselves. For Samuel, this was God's law. For restored Christianity, it must be the same. And finally, when institutions depart from their founding principles, restoration becomes necessary to reclaim what was lost. Just as Israel needed prophets to call kings back to constitutional fidelity, Christianity requires a restoration of gospel truths and priesthood authority to overcome centuries of apostasy. We may never find this lost document, but its principles illuminate a pattern we see repeatedly in religious history. Founding principles established, gradual departure from those principles, apostasy from truth, and the need for restoration. As you encounter claims of religious authority today, ask yourself, does this authority follow Samuel's model of constitutional accountability, or does it more closely resemble the unquestionable power that Samuel warned against? Well guys, thanks for joining me. I'm Alex Arnold, and this has been Arnie's Brain Train, where we uncover the hidden connections between ancient wisdom and modern truth. If you're ready to dig deeper into the scriptural texts your Sunday school teacher never mentioned, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. All of our sources are listed in the description below, so you can continue your own research journey. Leave a comment telling me what other lost scriptural knowledge you'd like me to explore, and until next time, keep your curiosity on track and your mind open to restored truth. Thanks guys, see ya.